it's a little overwhelming. I absolutely love being back in Little Rock, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really so honored to be here. And there are some people I want to thank who made all this possible. Of course, the Clinton School of Public Service, but also Skip Rutherford and Nikolai DePippa, Tom McGowan and Leah Lent, who are here for Wordsworth Books, also spearheaded this. So I want to thank them. I have family members here who have come from all over the nation, so I want to recognize them as well. Some of you may or may not know that this book was a long time in the coming. I kept my day job, and so it took me quite a while to put it together. My father first wrote his memoir 20 years ago. He was 73 years old, but he only completed about half of it, and it was relegated to the bottom drawer of a file cabinet where it stayed for 10 years, and I went and dusted it off, unearthed it, and delved into a trove of about more than 600 of his articles that he had written about the civil rights movement. So those articles were only up to 1965, so he's quite prolific. And then I would use those as a resource to combine each chapter, and he and I would work side by side to finish it before he died last year. I so wish he could be here tonight, but we have a great legacy of our family. So I realized in the process, too, that I had really been preparing all my life to help him with this book. And as Brittany pointed out, I just want to relay one particular story. In the summer of 1964, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders were right in the throes of their campaign to eradicate Jim Crow laws across the South, and also push Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill that summer. And so Martin Luther King was a brilliant strategist and even a better PR manager. He would deliberately pick cities that where the protesters would be greeted with the most virulent reactions, Birmingham, Selma, and one of those was St. Augustine. It really was it displayed the vilest kind of racism. The staunch right wing was very much established there. The sheriff's department deputized a band of vigilantes and members of the KKK to help thwart off the protesters. So my father was there for 6 weeks covering the violence, and it was incredibly violent, as you saw some of the clips showed. And he hadn't been home in 6 weeks, and we lived in Atlanta at the time. And so he told the New York Times, who he was writing for then, that he was going to take a weekend vacation and take his 4 daughters and his wife to the beach in Panama City. So when he gets home to Atlanta, we're all standing in the driveway. We've got on our bathing suits, our floaties, our flip-flops, and we're ready to go to the beach. He starts packing up the car, and the New York Times calls and says Martin Luther King's home, well, the home where Martin Luther King was staying in St. Augustine, had been firebombed for a second time. So they said, get back to St. Augustine and get back on the story. So he looked at us and said, riots or no riots, we're going to the beach. So he piled us in the car and took us to St. Augustine, which is a beachside community, He put us up in a hotel just north of town where he thought we could just swim and enjoy the time while he continued to work. So we've been there for about 3 days. And in the middle of the night, we were awakened by the sound of roaring pickup trucks. And I looked out the window, and there were bands of men hanging out of the cabs and the flatbed of the pickup trucks, and they all had guns and rifles, shotguns, and they're firing them in the air. I was 7 at the time, 8, something like that. And he... I think they were content to just keep their distance, but they obviously were wanting to scare us, which they did. My parents sort of quickly packed us up, and we skirted out of town in the middle of the night, back to Atlanta. And my father was back in St. Augustine the next day. But I really like to call my father the Forrest Gump of journalism. It seems he was at like every major event in American history. I mean, I kid you not. He covered the civil rights movement for more than a decade. Then we moved to Washington, D.C., and he covered Vietnam protests. He covered the riots breaking out in cities across America. He covered presidential campaigns, including Robert Kennedy's. He was with Robert Kennedy when he was assassinated in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He was the White House reporter during Nixon and Ford. He wrote the famous Nixon Resigns front page article. So he had quite a career. This book just covers the civil rights movement. But again, his Forrest Gumpism shows up once again. He first covered the impact of Brown versus Board of Education. He was at the Emmett Till trial. 3 months, he did that for the United Press International, and then he joined the New York Times. And 3 months after joining the New York Times, he's in Dallas for the assassination of John Kennedy. He's in Birmingham when the 4 girls are killed in the church bombing. He interviewed the parents of those children the night of the bombing. He's in Philadelphia, Mississippi when they dredge up the bodies of the 3 civil rights workers who had been slain there. He's in Selma. He covers the Medgar Edgar murder trials. I mean, he's just all over the place. So this book sort of speeds through with a firsthand account of those events. But it's a much deeper story as well. There's a narrative of his personal journey as a native son of the South who rejects the accepted mores and laws of a segregated society while still embracing his heritage. So it has sort of different narratives going on, but that's a much deeper one. Our country has witnessed 3 major attempts to rectify the racial injustices that were wrought by slavery. The first was in the early 1800s. Some small farmers in the South undertook an unsuccessful but pretty strong effort to abolish slavery. Now, it sounds very altruistic, and there may have been some altruistic motives, but mainly they wanted to prevent the establishment of the large plantation farmers who relied on slavery for that success. And then we saw in the South the post-Civil War Reconstruction. It really did bring some major advances for African Americans. The federal government required states to change their constitutions, and Mississippi had its first biracial election in 1867, and the black voter registration outnumbered white registration. During Reconstruction, Mississippi elected 200 black officials, including 2 U.S. senators. So there were some strides being made, but this revival only lasted less than a decade. Federal pressure waned, and then the Jim Crow laws eventually were enacted. So Martin Luther King was only 26 years old in 1955 when he was recruited to lead the 3rd major movement, which is what we now know as the Civil Rights Movement. It ushered in national laws that altered every institution in this country and changed the hearts and minds of many white Americans. Martin Luther King's battlefield was my father's backyard. My father grew up in small southern towns where his church, his school, his family, they all endure strict and uncompromising segregation of the races, and they perpetuated the belief that blacks were put on earth to be servants to whites. He didn't question this attitude and this status quo. I mean, almost no one questioned it at the time. When he was 18, he went off to the Philippines to serve in World War II. And he always said there was no good that ever came out of any war, but that there were some advantages for him personally. One, he discovered the joy of reading. The Army had very good libraries, and there was a lot of downtime. And so he really learned about a larger world outside what he knew by reading. And he also met people who were different from him. So it gave him a much more worldly approach to life. When he returned to Mississippi after graduating from college, he had his first newspaper job in 1949. And he saw his native homeland differently at that time. One of his first assignments was this execution of Willie Mcgee that was mentioned in the film. It's not very well known today, but at the time it garnered international acclaim. Willie Mcgee contended that it was a consensual relationship between him and this white woman, but he was convicted of rape and sentenced to death. And at that time, Mississippi had a traveling electric chair, this big giant oak thing, and they would show up at the courthouse, erect the chair in the courtroom, run an electric cable out the window to a generator in a truck sitting on the courthouse lawn. So I want to read an excerpt from the book that describes what he saw when he was covering the execution, and also his reaction to that. Let me get some water. My favorite water, by the way. I have this, believe it or not, I have it brought to our house in Washington. Can't give up Arkansas. By 10 p.m., more than 500 people had gathered outside the courthouse. Most were men, some sitting in lawn chairs, who mumbled and laughed as they waited. The weather was pleasant and the scene festive. Boys and young men climbed to the top limbs of tall trees around the courthouse for a better view through the open windows. I pushed my way forward to the front of the crowd. "Let's everybody be nice," a highway patrolman standing on the concrete courthouse steps said to calm the crowd. When he announced that Mcgee was going to die, everyone shouted a cheerful glee. "We want no demonstrations," the patrolman said. "You have been patient a long time." Those of us outside knew the execution had begun when the generator loudly clicked into gear. A cheer went up among the crowd around me. I felt sick as blood washed from my face. The guards loaded Mcgee's listless body onto a gurney, and the crowd cheered again when the black funeral attendants carted the body, covered with a white sheet, to a black hearse outside the courthouse. The attendants appeared frightened, and law enforcement officers pushed the crowd back. I looked around me and thought about how barbaric the scene was. There seemed to be an inordinate amount of cruelty in those times, perhaps because people had just come out of the brutality of World War II. But whatever the reason, the meanness was so immediate that it resonated deeply with me. Once the hearse drove away, there wasn't much left to hold the crowd's attention at such a late hour, and people began meandering home. I did the same, feeling emotionally and physically drained and much older than my 27 years. So it was experiences like this, and then a litany of many more, that caused him to reconcile his heritage and this changing world around him. It was not an easy journey. He risked his safety and his standing in society and even among his family and friends, but he held this very strong moral and religious conviction that his role was to bear witness, to tell the world. James Baldwin said, "History is not our past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history." That could never be more true than today. We are now, as a nation, poised at the threshold of a fourth major revolution for change. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Gardner, Stephon Clark, and I'm not including all the ones, unfortunately. They are the new Emmett Tills. The Charleston church shooting, it's today's Birmingham. The cries today for white supremacy echo the same segregationist calls in the 1950s and 1960s. The Charlottesville rally resembles the KKK marches and rallies my father wrote about in the book. And hate has once again reared its ugly head, and it's become acceptable again. So why now, after this decades lull that we've had in this country, are we now seeing another, what I contend is another major revolution? I have my own theories. First is just sheer demographics. In 20 years, for the first time in this nation, it will be unprecedented, whites will no longer be in the majority. There will be a collection of what we consider minorities who will make up a larger proportion of our nation's population than whites. So the country's changing. Second, a survey of America today, I think, makes clear that we did not see the civil rights struggle through. Our lack of perseverance and vigilance in the last 3 decades to uphold the standards of the civil rights laws have left us with a list of systemic and institutional inequalities. Disparate funding and resegregation of schools, a high incarceration rate among African Americans, it's 5 times that of whites, and a racial wealth gap in which white families' average wealth is 7 times greater than black families. So change is being demanded. Third, we have these new modes, not commodes, we need those too, new modes of communication. That's what happens when you put modes and communication together, you get commodes. New modes of communication and information that allow the voices of many people to be heard. Now, you don't have to be a reporter for the New York Times anymore to document and relay scenes of injustice, and we see it all the time today. It's a really dynamic time to be alive. I remind my students that even though it's a very difficult time, it's not often that you have the opportunity to watch history in the making. And there is an opportunity for change more now than I think we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years. This book reminds us that through talking and listening to someone different from us, whether it be religion, race, locale, we can find common ground. The sharing of stories with integrity, fairness, truth is an integral part of understanding each other and finding a way forward. So I hope that this book will enlighten and also provide a platform of encouragement as we struggle with racial issues in America today. So, thank you.
Great job.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I deliberately didn't want to go on too long because I'm much more interested to know what you all are thinking and need questions. So.
All right, we have time for questions, so please raise your hand. Let's get the microphone to you. We need a microphone come on, don't be scared.
Oh, there's always that first person has to break the ice.
Who's going to break the ice? Come on, first question. There it is, right back here, John Riley. He got it.
I could ask 100 questions because at my age we all live this, and I was interested that when you talk about the great revolution that's taking place now, and I wonder if you included a component of the breakdown of middle America. You see the drug addiction in white communities and in poor white areas, methamphetamines and oxycodone, and there's not a pathway to the middle class for a lot of individuals in a lot of racial groups. And if that, once again, isn't pitting us against one another, not just race, but the economic impact of race.
I think it's a great comment and a great question. And the disparity in this country now among those haves and have-nots is among the greatest in the history of this country. And it marginalizes people. And, I think in this day and age, people are not going to allow to be marginalized anymore. And wherever they may find their outlet, whether it's, through whomever they elect for president or other elected officials, whether it's, demonstrating in the streets, whatever it may be, I think that is a major element in what we're seeing today, is that disparity of income.
Questions? We got a group of journalists in here and nobody asking questions. I knew that was a challenge that could not be denied. John Brummett.
Wait a minute, you know better. You're not supposed to ask me a question. No.
Got you.
Let me ask it this way. Your dad was part of journalism when it was a great moral voice, civil rights movement. Still was in Watergate, was in the Pentagon Papers. It was the great newspapers, basically. Now you tell us we're in yet another uprising of great racial problem. Is there a journalistic voice now? Is there a moral journalistic voice now?
Well, that's a very good question. And I do think that we have an incredible number of voices now, and they were not the gatekeepers we saw in the past. There's a lot of diversity in the voices now, which is different. This was a great period my father lived in, good, solid journalism, especially credible journalism. And I'll answer that, but let me just digress a minute. He writes in the book about how difficult it was to remain objective and just the facts, ma'am, just tell the truth. And there's one instance where he's watching a woman brutally beaten by some police, and his instinct, he says, was to punish the bully, to go and help this poor woman and defend her. But he says, I knew I would risk my credibility and my ability to use the power of the pen in future moments. So he didn't, and he really had a strong, strict adherence to objectivity for that reason. You know, we've got a lot of, there's a lot of noise in journalism right now, and partisanship and the celebrity status that comes with it. But I just think about last week, and not to, promote the New York Times too much, but I still think of it as a great newspaper. When Brian Stevenson in Montgomery, Alabama, opened this new museum, the New York Times took its entire page of not just op-ed pieces, but from their editorial board, which would be two. Usually they just do one on one topic, one on another. Both topics were on the racial history and how we need to move beyond the racial history and what the significance of this museum is and will be in doing that. So I do think there are some very strong voices. I just talk to people all the time who are trying to figure out what our role is and where we fit. And journalism has always been a great moniker or clarion call to help us understand that. And I think you just have to be very critical consumers and very skeptical. Where does the information come from? It makes it a lot harder for you as a reader, and you have to work harder. It's to really decipher where you're getting your information. Is it biased? And you always have some bias with the New York Times still, or different, but overall, where can I get the best objective journalism? And many times it means, changing the channel or, trying a different publication. But there's such a wealth of resources out there right now. So I'm optimistic. I try to keep my students optimistic when they ask me questions like that. So some people call this the golden age of journalism. We'll see. I think in the respect that there is just so much available there. But you have to get through all the noise. And I really have a problem with, where we are currently with that. Hi, how are you? I didn't see you right there. Get on my toes.
Did your father have any professional regrets?
Oh, that's a good question.
Some people didn't hear that. The question was, did your father have any professional regrets?
Well, none that he voiced to me, but that's a very interesting question. I don't think so. He never had a regret that he had spent too much time in his job, which, the adage that nobody ever said they didn't spend enough time at the office. And one reason we went with him a lot was because he was so busy, and he would take us with him so we could see him. No, not that I know of. Good question, though. I'm going to have to think on that.
Yes, sir. Well, she'll bring you the microphone right up there.
Did your father ever personally interview Dr. Martin Luther King?
He did. He traveled with Martin Luther King oh gosh, for almost, a decade. But, and it was always large rallies. He always had a battery of advisors with him. But on one particular occasion in St. Augustine, and it was the day before the Civil Rights Act was to be signed by President Johnson, he had a one-on-one sit-down interview on the front porch of a home in St. Augustine, and he describes it in the book. And at the time, Martin Luther King's nonviolent philosophy was being challenged. The toll was incredibly high for a nonviolent reaction. Hundreds of people were in the jails. People had been beaten, they had been killed, and a lot of people were saying, you can't just subject yourself to the brutality of the police and not fight back. So they were really questioning Martin Luther King. And my father was pretty tough on him in the questioning of how can you continue to adhere to this nonviolent philosophy and movement when so many of your soldiers are being fallen. And the responses from Martin Luther King, he was a brilliant man, left my father leaving that day saying that he felt like he had been schooled at the knees of all the great theologians, philosophers, history makers. My father was not, he did not have adulation for people of anyone, or especially, celebrities or someone who had a celebrity status. But this was as close as my father came to being in awe of someone, the way he describes it. So yeah, it was a pretty cool encounter.
There's a question right back here, and then we'll come over here. Right behind you, Bob.
Sorry. I was hiding. Okay, your dad lived, you said he grew up in the South, and so he understood the culture that he was raised within, but then he had exposure and experiences that broadened his mindset and his understanding of other people's experiences. How would he have recommended to share that exposure and that mindset with people who maybe hadn't had the same experiences or interactions that he did in order to build that bridge for other people?
That's a good question. I think he did on a religious level. He was deeply religious. He didn't wear it on his sleeve. But he was just such a strong believer in those basic tenets of faith, love, hope, and charity, which convey across all platforms. It doesn't have to be in the midst of a civil rights movement, but just the basic way you treat people. So there was a much larger sort of universal grace to him that he did convey. He worked in the church. He was a deacon in the church. He taught Sunday school. But I think he just carried it out in his life as well. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
Question right there. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Part Moore in 1962.
Oh my gosh, he baptized me.
Wow.
And that was not a setup for you. I did not know. Wow. Hello. Hi.
In 1962, I became pastor of Trinity Presbyterian in Jackson, Mississippi. Right. John was a deacon. The Herbers were all part of that congregation. But how much support we got from the way he recounted the news, and how much, because we were working with civil rights and later with school immigration, and just so much turmoil, and to know that, hey, this kind of writing is true and not the kind of stuff we've been reading in the Clarion Ledger.
True. Thank you so much. So, one of the downsides, is there are now questions. I thought I had asked my father everything I could possibly ask him. We worked so closely side by side, but I didn't ask that question. And I didn't ask whether, when he was working in the church at that time, and you can answer this. This is great. I'm going to turn this around as a journalist. I'm going to start asking you questions. Did he talk about the civil rights movement and what he had seen, when he was on the road and when he came back
Not particularly. We just had a personal sense that both of us were on the same path.
Right.
And that was very helpful and encouraging
Yeah, and
in so many ways.
I have to say that he heavily relied on the message that was conveyed through the pulpit on Sundays. And sometimes we would go to a church and they'd get a new pastor who he felt he wasn't gaining any spiritual growth or direction from. Not you. They loved you. And we would leave that church and go find another one where the preacher might be more in line. So thank you. That's great. Wow,
We have a
that's so
question
great.
back. Bob, do you have a question back there?
Well, I was just curious, was it infant baptism or age of accountability? That's all I wanted to know.
You don't have to answer that question.
I was going to say, I'm not. You can notice I didn't answer.
I know. That's just John Riley is the best. Okay. Any other? Yeah, we got plenty of questions. Here's one right here.
Hi. So my question to you, I'm kind of feeding off, your dad didn't really talk much about the civil rights, but this is kind of two-part. If he didn't talk about it, what perspective did he kind of give you as far as race relations? That's part one.
Okay.
Part two, if you ever came across any instances of where they knew your daddy was covering something like that in school and you had to speak against or for a certain issue. How did you address that, and how could children these days and what we're living in, what would you suggest, how do they handle that?
Really good question. My father, he had this incredible career, but he was he was a classic Southern genteel man, very humble. And when he came home from these, travesties he saw, our home was a sanctuary. And when we were little, when we were older, we talked about politics a lot. But when we were little, he'd come home, he would leave it at the door. But then he would take us with him on these assignments, even as young children. And he was not dogmatic. He didn't, watch this and learn from this, and you shouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do that. He just exposed us. We were taught to see a larger world. It was not about us. When he came home, it was about us. But when we go out, it was a much larger world. I didn't feel the ostracization that my parents did. They were ostracized, not after we moved to Washington, but in the South. My mom worked in volunteer church and school things, and she, was alienated by people because of who he was, what he was writing about. So I didn't feel that as a child. When we lived in Atlanta, the only children who had integrated were Martin Luther King's children. And three of them went to school. They were in different grades than I was at the time, but we all went to the same school. And I do remember him saying that he thought that was great, that, the schools had been integrated, but there weren't, not enough. So, yeah, it's interesting. I didn't feel the scorn or the wrath, at least that I knew growing up. So, and then we moved to Washington when I was 12. So then it was a much more, sort of inclusive group.
Okay, I have a question right back there.
Hi. First of all, I want to say I'm sorry to hear about your father's passing.
Thank you.
And you talked about how he had to reconcile with his Southern heritage and everything that he saw. And I'm wondering if he ever spoke with you about what in particular about Southern culture should change, or what kind of cultural values can be adapted so that we can really do a lot of the healing here in the South, because while racism is so endemic across the country, it seems like the South really has that poster child image of being like the true racists, I guess. I'm wondering if he ever discussed what he thought should change with you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Later on, when things had changed in the South, he thought that that reputation of the South as being so racist was not fair because the rest of the nation was having, I mean, you look at the Boston desegregation riots, you look at, I mean, all the riots, you know, in Detroit and Los Angeles, and those were race riots. And he felt the South had been not unjustly targeted, but targeted, and that stereotype remained. I mean, they did have the Jim Crow laws when other places in the country didn't. But after they rectified things, you know, they were still, I think, unfairly targeted as not having made enough progress. And I think that's still true today. It just gets tough when you look at the South. It's like, oh boy, I mean, the South is, do we have a lecture here on Faulkner? And go through a whole litany of things. But he, we moved to Washington. We would come back south twice, 3 times a year. And we were always told, you're a Southerner, don't forget your Southern heritage. He said, you know, your mother and I may not always approve of everything that happens in the South, but it's still this great place, and don't forget who you are and where you came from. Now, there were some other lessons as well. One is described in the book when we were little, and we were living in the South, and we drove to see my grandmother, who was my father's mother, and we spent the weekend with them. And then we packed us into the car to drive back to Memphis. We were living at the time, and she lived in Mississippi. It was about a 4-hour drive, and he pulled the car over almost as soon as we left the driveway, and he turned back to the 4 of us and said, I don't ever want to hear you use the N-word. I know you heard all our relatives using it. He said the word, he didn't say the N-word, but you know, he says, I don't want to hear that word ever coming out of your mouth. And of course, I had to be the one to counter him on that. I said, well, why didn't you tell grandmother not to use that word? And he said, because your mother is always to be respected, and some people will never learn. And they left it at that. So there were lessons along the way to reject this type of climate, but still, you know, to remember who we were and where we came from.
Question right here.
This is more of a personal question for you. How has all this experience kind of changed you and your interactions with your students, your family, and your regard with race? How did you reconcile all those questions personally?
Oh boy, I haven't internalized this very much. You know, I was handed an incredible opportunity. I mean, you know, going to St. Augustine was just one of the experiences. He took us to KKK marches. When I was 16, we went on a tour of America's cities that had been ravaged by, I know, ghetto. I mean, it's, you know, been ravaged by riots. You know, when you go back to school, it's like, what did you do on your summer vacation? Well, you know, nobody said, oh, I went to see Americans' inner cities ravaged by riots. He and I were tear gassed on the lawn of the Capitol during a Vietnam protest that he was covering, and he took me with him. You know, we traveled with Nixon and Ford, and he would send me down to the press office, you know, to pick up his messages. So I didn't have a chance. I was going to be a journalist. That was all. Obviously, I had been so indoctrinated. But he had this insatiable curiosity. And I'm somewhat the same way. I just want to know. I'm not scared of going new places and meeting different kinds of people. We moved every year of my life when we lived in the South. I was always exposed to different experiences. And I think just generally speaking is sort of a universal, you know, advice. It can be scary times. You know, you can't be scared. You can, it gets boring that way. It's a little more exciting to just see beyond yourself and see other people. But he also gave me a great interest in social policy issues, racial issues. I mean, it's in my DNA, I guess. So.
Got a question right here. Jay.
Hi, Jay.
Hi. I'm always note and somewhat envy the bonds among reporters who have worked together in the past, as witnessed by your colleagues here. Obviously, you have a cadre of amazingly talented journalists who are following the movement, your father being one of them. Could you talk a little bit about the way in which they work together as colleagues, kind of traveling across the South? How did those relationships kind of play out? How did they rely upon one another?
Yeah, we are a thick band, aren't we? Well, when you are an objective observer like he did and took on forces that were unpopular, you alienate yourself. My parents didn't belong in any clubs. They had some good friends, but not many. But the journalists all did tend to find a home within each other because they were all sort of outcasts, questioning authority. That's what journalists do. So it was really interesting growing up in a household with a lot of journalists too. Unfortunately, in the period of this book, the press corps was segregated. There were great black journalists, but they all worked for the black media outlets, and the whites worked for the white media outlets. The New York Times didn't hire a black reporter to cover the South. They covered my father, and they asked my father to cover it, and they thought they were being very foresighted because they'd got a Southerner, So he regretted that there was that separation as well, and he regretted there were not more women reporters at the time. But it was quite a band, and they worked together pretty well. There was competition, but they all reinforced each other sometimes.
Okay, I know we could keep on going on, but we want to have time for everybody individually to visit with Ann and have the opportunity to purchase Deep South Dispatch. Let's give Ann Farris Rosen a round of applause.